We're continuing our lecture on ignorance of the law is no excuse. And we are on habit number 6. Habit number 6. In order to break the habit of ignorance, engage in self-examination, root out your flaws. As I said, ignorance is not only being blind to the nature of one's real self. Ignorance is also being blind to the nature of one's unreal self, what the ascended masters call the dweller on the threshold. The great sage Sanat Kumara teaches in the Mahabharata, "He that knoweth self also knoweth what is not self." Unfortunately, whether we realize it or not, we sometimes subscribe to the belief what we don't know won't hurt us. It's like the Eskimo that asked the local missionary, "If I didn't know about God and sin, would I go to hell?" "No," said the priest. "Then why," asked the Eskimo in all sincerity, "did you tell me?" But our true spiritual teachers tell us that what we don't know will definitely hurt us. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus teaches, "Whoever knows the all but fails to know himself lacks everything." The Chinese sage Lao Tzu said, "Knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is true wisdom. Mastering others is strength. Mastering yourself is true power." In order to make spiritual progress, we must master ourselves, every part of ourselves. We must be willing to squarely acknowledge and face the ugly elements of our personality and our psychology. Make no mistake about it, it isn't easy. It takes courage. But you have that courage, and I know you will exercise it. It takes love, love of God and love of ourselves, and the love of the people we hurt when we don't get rid of our barbs. It takes hard work. You know the adage, no pain, no gain. Yet how many of us anesthetize ourselves so we won't have to feel the pain of our karma? We keep a veil of delusion around ourselves so we won't have to face reality. We avoid the people and the circumstances that represent our karma or that could help us see our faults more clearly. As the 19th century writer Thomas Carlyle once said, "The greatest of faults, I should say, is to be conscious of none." Teresa of Avila tells the story of a woman who avoided confronting her faults and thereby stifled her spiritual progress. She was very fond, says Teresa, of receiving communion frequently. She never said anything bad about anyone. She experienced devotion in her prayer and lived in constant solitude. She was so mild in her temperament that nothing said to her ever made her angry or say any bad word, for she was quite perfect. Since I saw all these virtues, it seemed to me they were effects of a very advanced soul and of deep prayer. And I esteemed this lady highly at the beginning, because I didn't see her offend God and understood that she guarded against doing so. But after getting to know her, I began to understand that all was peaceful as long as her self-interest was not affected. But when her own interests were at stake, her conscience was not so delicate, but actually easygoing. I learned that although she would suffer all the things that were said against her, she would not tolerate anything said against her reputation, even in some tiny point concerning her honor or the esteem she thought was her due. She was so overcome by this misery, so eager to know everything that was said against these, and so fond of her comfort, that I was amazed how such a person could live even an hour. She embellished all this in such a way that it appeared free from sin. I was really bewildered. Almost everyone considered her to be a saint, although I observed that she must have been somewhat at fault for the persecutions she underwent. And I did not envy her manner of living and sanctity. Rather, she and 2 other souls that I have seen in this life, who were saints in their own opinion, caused me more fear after I spoke with them than all the sinners I have seen. I beg the Lord to give us light. There are souls whom, it seems, nothing keeps from flying off to heaven. They seek perfection in everything, in their opinion, but there is no one to inform them of their faults. These so-called saints that Teresa is describing, who are really egotists, remind me of a story Archbishop Fulton Sheen once told, the story of the egotist who went to the doctor for a headache. The doctor asked him, "Do you feel a distressing pain in the forehead?" "Yes," said the patient. "And a rather throbbing pain in the back of the head?" "Yes." "And piercing pains here at the side?" "Yes." "Ah," the doctor explained, "your halo is on too tight." As Teresa of Avila says, one way to figure out if your halo is on too tight is to associate with people who will lovingly point out to you your faults. Another way to overcome self-ignorance is to go about it systematically. A method for doing just that was created by that eminently practical American who brought us the world's first subscription library, the first lightning rod, and the first bifocals. His name was? Right. In his autobiography, Franklin tells of a simple but effective system for self-examination that worked for him. It's a great way to overcome self-ignorance and attain self-knowledge. Franklin explains that when he was in his 20s, he conceived of the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. He referred to it as the art of virtue. "I wished to live without committing any fault at any time," he writes. "As I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But I soon found out I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. While my care was employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took the advantage over intention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason." From this, Franklin concluded that the mere desire to be virtuous was not enough to prevent his slipping. He realized that the contrary habits must be broken and good ones acquired. In order to accomplish this, Franklin devised the following method. First, he made a list of moral virtues and grouped them under 13 headings. Here is his list. You might want to write it down. The first moral virtue on his list is temperance. And then he gives himself directions under that. He says, number 1, temperance. Eat not to dullness. Drink not to elevation. He notes that temperance can also be interpreted as moderating every other pleasure, appetite, inclination, or passion, bodily or mental, even to our avarice and ambition. Temperance sounds like Gautama Buddha's middle way. Second moral virtue, silence. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Moral virtue number 3, order. Let all your things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. Fourth moral virtue, resolution. Resolve to perform what you ought. Perform without fail what you resolve. The corollary is, do not resolve what you do not find you are able to perform. Make only those resolutions in that which you are determined to do. Fifth moral virtue, frugality. Make no expense but to do good to others or yourself. That is, waste nothing. Waste nothing. Sixth moral virtue, industry. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. Seventh moral virtue, sincerity. Use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly. Eighth moral virtue, justice. Wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty. Ninth moral virtue, moderation. Avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. 10th moral virtue, cleanliness. Tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. 11th moral virtue, tranquility. Be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents common or unavoidable. 12th moral virtue, chastity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. Venery, spelled V-E-N-E-R-Y, is indulgence in sexual desire. 13th moral virtue, humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. That's all he says. If you do that, you will know true humility. Franklin says that his list originally included only 12 virtues, but he added humility as the 13th. He says, "When a Quaker friend kindly informed me that I was generally thought proud, that my pride showed itself frequently in conversation, that I was not content with being in the right when discussing any point, but was overbearing and rather insolent, of which he convinced me by mentioning several instances." In other words, Ben Franklin admits that his halo was on too tight. Having settled on his 13 virtues, Franklin made a little book where he could grade himself on his progress in acquiring these virtues. This is how he set it up. You can see a slide on the screen that will show you. At the top of each page, he wrote the name of a different virtue. Under that virtue, he wrote the precepts of that virtue that I read to you. For instance, the first page was headed Temperance. Under it, he wrote, "Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation." The second page was headed Silence, and so on. Even though each page was devoted to a separate virtue, every page had a chart that listed all 13 virtues. That's on the left side of it. He listed the virtues down the vertical left-hand column signified by the first letter of the virtue. So the left-hand column had the letters going from top to bottom, T, S, O, R, F, I, S, J, M, C, T, C, H. Then he wrote the first letter of each day of the week across the top of the page and divided the page into 7 columns, one for each day of the week. In this way, he had a grid where each day he could grade himself on each virtue. He would do this every evening. For instance, on Monday evening, he would go down the Monday column and mark a little black spot in the box of the virtue he had not exemplified. He would focus on one virtue per week, but he would grade himself daily and weekly on all of them. He writes, "I determined to give a week's strict attention to each of the virtues successively. Thus, in the first week, my great guard was to avoid the least offense against temperance, leaving the other virtues to their ordinary chance. Thus, if in the first week I could keep my first line, marked T for temperance, clear of spots, I suppose the habit of that virtue so much strengthened and its opposite weakened that I might venture extending my attention to include the next, and for the following week keep both lines clear of spots. Proceeding thus to the last, I could go through a course complete in 13 weeks and 4 courses in a year. This is a very unique mind that has arisen out of all humanity to be one of our great founding fathers. He's very ambitious and very meticulous. Franklin says that by this system he could be like a gardener. A gardener does not attempt to eradicate all the weeds at once because this would exceed his reach and his strength, but instead he works on one of his beds at a time. Having weeded the first, he proceeds to a second, following the same procedure for weeding out faults, Franklin says. I hoped to have the encouraging pleasure of seeing on my pages the progress I made in virtue by clearing successively my lines of their spots, till in the end, by a number of courses, I should be happy in viewing a clean book after a 13 weeks daily examination. I entered upon the execution of this plan for self-examination and continued it with occasional intermissions for some time. I was surprised to find myself so much fuller of faults than I had imagined. But I had the satisfaction of seeing them diminish. With regard to the virtue of order, he writes, in truth, I found myself incorrigible with respect to order. He laments that he fell far short of the perfection he wanted to attain. Yet, he says, I was by the endeavor of striving for it a better and a happier man than I otherwise should have been if I had not attempted it at all. In later years, when he was very busy traveling and dealing with a multiplicity of affairs, he was not able to put much attention on grading himself. But, says Franklin, I always carried my little book with me. He writes in his autobiography that his descendants should take this lesson from his art of virtue. It may well be that to this little artifice, with a blessing of God, their ancestor owed the constant felicity of his life down to his 79th year in which this is written. So much for Benjamin Franklin. I would like you all to know that Mrs. Ballard was embodied as Benjamin Franklin. And you can see very clearly the positioning of the features in the face and the forehead. And so that was her preparation, among many other lifetimes of preparation, for her final embodiment. Ben Franklin himself says he will come back one final time. So she did have the final embodiment and made her ascension. Another way to cultivate the habit of engaging in self-examination and rooting out your flaws is to examine the motives behind your actions. Ketsen Sangpo Rinpoche, a Tibetan Buddhist priest and scholar, tells how a Gadamba Geshe cultivated this habit. A Geshe is the Tibetan Buddhist equivalent of a doctor of theology. It is very important to realize, Ketsen Sangpo says, that the effects of virtuous and non-virtuous thoughts and wishes can be extremely powerful. Even if a person appears to be engaging in virtue, if his motivation is evil, the effect will be very bad. Therefore, it is necessary to be mindful at all times and aware of your motivation and thoughts. In this way, if your mind is carried away by bad thoughts or poor motivation, you will be able to stop them. How should such mindfulness and introspection be used? A Gadamba Geshe was expecting a visit from his patrons, so he rose early and made his house very beautiful, cleaning it well and attractively arranging offerings on his altar. When he had finished, he sat on his meditation cushion and revived his mindfulness and introspection to analyze what he had just been doing. Very quickly he understood that his cleaning and arranging had been motivated by a desire for praise and a wish to receive further donations from his patrons. He rose, took a handful of dirt, and sprinkled it everywhere, on top of the offerings, into the water in the bowls, and over the floor. Then he sat down again on his meditation cushion and beat his breast, saying, "O monk, do not be so careless. You must take care." The arriving patrons were surprised to hear the loud noise and to find the house in such chaos. "What is wrong?" they asked. "Did a robber come?" The Geshe told them. The robber that made this mess was not physical but mental. The great Indian teacher Bodhidharma was visiting Tibet at this time, and when, through his clairvoyance, he realized that the Kadamba Geshe had done, he said, "There is no better practitioner of doctrine in Tibet than he." He covered with dirt the head of the being who threatened to draw him down into a bad rebirth. The being, of course, was his dweller on the threshold. The same Kadamba Geshe once came to recite religious books at the home of his patrons, who went out after he had finished, leaving a container of tea within reach of where he sat. In his own meditation hut, he had no such tea, so it occurred to him to take some of the tea while the others were outside. As he was reaching for it, his mindfulness and introspection returned, and he immediately began shouting, "Robber, robber!" The patrons came running into the room and said, "Where is he? Where is the robber?" The Geshe replied, "A monk is robbing you. It is my own hand. Would you kindly cut it off?" By being always mindful and introspective, continues Ketsun Sangpo, you can develop the superior view, and your own behavior will be without blemish. Perhaps Benjamin Franklin was a bodhisattva in our midst. Indeed, it is very difficult for ordinary people not to have unworthy thoughts, but the most important point is not to be carried away by them when they arise, and through mindfulness and introspection to avoid becoming stuck in them. Well, there's an old saying, if you have been tempted into evil, fly from it. It is not falling into the water, but lying in it that drowns. I would like to play for you now some wisdom Mark Prophet once gave on this subject.
We must be aware that we deal with subtleties. That's the thing I want to bring across. We must be aware that we deal with subtleties in ourselves as well as in the dark forces. For there is lodged in the microcosm of man the self-same conditions that are in the macrocosm of the universe. And all men have to learn to counteract these negative imbalances in themselves. And the way in which you counteract them is entirely a divine way. Jesus had this same problem. And that's why he said, go tell that fox that tomorrow I cast out demons and I heal the sick and I do God's work. The third day I shall be perfected. Because there is a season of man's perfection. But he must remember that he does not suddenly become perfect. He is becoming perfect every day. There is an element of God's perfection working in him continually. It's a powerful force, far more powerful than the dark forces. And the thing is, the dark forces are also there because they're in the world. And what's in the world manifests also in us. And so we have to counteract the negations of the world in ourselves as well as in the world. To counteract them in the world may be effective in part, but the greatest way of counteracting them is in ourselves, by simply not submitting to all these desires and pressures of the world. Because this is what Jesus had to contend with. And so he said, The third day I shall be perfected. We take it by steps. We do our best each day. And don't feel bad if you sometimes have this bird land on your head. Don't let him build a nest in your hair. That's the deal. If he lands on your head, oh, get out of here. Big bird, fly away. But don't stay here and entertain him. I mean, if you think some bad thought, don't get mad at yourself and hate yourself for it. You have residual substance. It attracts that thought to you. It's in yourself. Pluck up the weeds in yourself, the bad thought, and you help to pluck it up in the world. Do you understand? You're helping thousands of people by plucking it up in yourself. You don't even know this, but you are.
In one of his dictations, Gautama Buddha suggested that we seek the help of Cyclopea's all-seeing eye to correct our misconceptions about ourselves. He said, give Cyclopea a 24-hour cycle to answer a round of decrees to that mighty Elohim of the fifth ray, to enlighten you, to correct your vision, that you might see what you should see. See what you see in 24 hours before deciding to go ahead with your plans that may seem so right in the moment. Ask God to show you what stands in the way of the dawning of your God reality. Ask Him to show you your mistakes, and don't be surprised if you hear about them from an unexpected source. I would like to tell you that I have tried this with cyclopeas over the years, and I would find each time that I would give 36 or more cyclopeas, within the next 24 or 48 hours, I would receive a great revelation from God. I can't tell you why I don't do this every single day of my life, except that my duties seem to carry me away and use up the hours. But if one can receive a great revelation after giving these cyclopeas, it is certainly worthwhile doing it often. I think it would be a great way to conclude our Wednesday night healing services for the healing of the mind and the opening of the spiritual eye, so that we who are blind in some areas of our being might see. Some of you know that one of El Moria's mottos is, if the messenger be an ant, heed him. Or as the author of Hebrews advises, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. You never know when an angel or a master will come knocking at your door in the person of a friend or a stranger. I want to tell you that when I was a student in Boston, still looking for direct contact with those in embodiment who knew Saint Germain, I decided that I had to put myself on a course of self-discipline, and this self-discipline was based on being obedient to the voice of God within. I also decided that whatever came into my life or whatever was around me was possibly the product of my own state of consciousness. And so I thought that I should take responsibility for those things that were near me or in the city or even on the planet. What part did my state of consciousness play in it, and what could I do to purify my consciousness? So this motto of El Moria reminds me of what happened to me one day as I was in a bus. Moria says, if the messenger be an ant, heed him. And in this case, my messenger was an ant eater. I was riding along in the bus, going where I was going, and I was meditating and fully involved in my fiery determination that I was going to find Saint Germain no matter what. And so I looked out the window and I saw someone walking an anteater on a leash. Now, I already thought in my own heart that an anteater was the most slothful, unwholesome of all animals, and to merely look upon one was of revulsion to me. So here I was sitting in the bus, and I saw this anteater, and I said to myself, what is the matter with you that you have seen an anteater? So I decided that this anteater must be bringing me a message of something that I must do with my consciousness to be ready for Saint Germain. So whether it's an ant or an anteater, do something about it when you are approached. Another motto you should remember is, don't be afraid to make mistakes. As someone once said, the road to wisdom, well, it's plain and simple to express. Err, and err, and err again, but less and less and less. You might pronounce that word The man who makes no mistakes, said the Irish Bishop William Connor McGee, does not usually make anything. As I have taught you before, you have the right to make mistakes. Why else would God have given you free will? Free will is the grand and noble experiment whereby you achieve individuality in God. So every Chela has that right. When a master takes on a Chela, he anticipates that the Chela will make mistakes in the course of his Chelaship. The Chela is going to learn either by obedience or by his own deliberations, and then some of his deliberations may result in inaccurate conclusions. So he will make some decisions that are mistakes and some decisions that are not mistakes, and he will learn. The masters are not going to throw you out if you make a mistake, and they are not interested in having robots for Chelas who walk around with a perpetual self-image that they are perfect people, or, on the contrary, that they are very imperfect people. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's not mistakes that cause you to fail. It's making the same mistake over and over again and not getting to the root of why you are doing it. That can cause your failure and be your undoing. This is one thing I remember about our beloved Florence Miller. Florence was a staff member who passed on in 1979 and made her ascension. As you know, she was embodied as Teresa of Avila. When I had to correct her, I barely had to speak in a whisper. Florence would immediately adjust the rudder of her ship to a greater alignment with God, with but a few words of correction. She was such a contrast to the kind of person who harbors the same bad habits year in and year out and has to be counseled again and again on the same subject. This certainly is wasting your time and wasting the Master's time. Florence took very seriously the tremendous opportunity we all have to work out our salvation. I saw the beauty of her soul as she responded to our every word and teaching. It is such a joy to teach Chelas on the path who are teachable and who are willing to dig into habit number 6, engage in self-examination, root out your flaws. I wish you a God-victorious year of working on that habit and all of the ones I'm bringing to your attention. Habit number 7. In order to break the habit of ignorance, see things as they really are. Desire to see things as they really are, and not as you wish them to be. Do not engage in wishful thinking. So this habit is see things as they really are. In order to see things as they really are, we need to try to see things the way Christ Jesus would see them, to look at things objectively through the Christ mind. Seeing things as they really are is not seeing through the evil eye or the jaundiced eye of bigotry, prejudice, or criticism. And it is not seeing through the sympathetic eye that indulges the human ego rather than dispensing the true compassion of the Christ that heals the human condition and then goes beyond it. Seeing things the way they really are is learning that the way you have been taught to see things, or the way you have been used to seeing them, is not the only way to see, and is not necessarily the best way. How often do we mentally put down another person simply because they are not like us, because they don't talk like us, or dress like us, or think like us? How often do we put down someone from another ethnic group because his way of life or mannerisms are different from ours? How often do we put down someone else's religion because their beliefs are not like ours, or so we think? Earlier, I defined ignorance as blindness to the true nature of one's real self and blindness to the true nature of one's unreal self. Ignorance is also blindness to the true nature of the real and unreal self of others. Ramakrishna advised, "Serve God who dwells in all beings." Krishna teaches in the Bhagavad Gita, "God dwells in the heart of all beings, Arjuna. Thy God dwells in thy heart." The yogi sees himself in the heart of all beings, and he sees all beings in his heart. Why? Because the yogi knows that he is Atman, and that Atman is in every heart. Therefore he is one with all beings. And when he sees me in all, and he sees all in me, then I never leave him, and he never leaves me. And when a man sees that the God in himself is the same God in all that is, he hurts not himself by hurting others. Then he goes indeed to the highest path. End of the quote from Krishna. The Lord commanded the Israelites through Moses, "Thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people." Resentment, revenge, and retaliation. That is the line of the clock, number 11, on which Lord Maitreya, the great Buddha of this mystery school, initiates us. Getting rid of avenging and grudging others is so very important. Moses said, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." This statement has two meanings. You will love your neighbor as you love yourself. And the second meaning is, you will love your neighbor because you know that the self that is in him is God, and that that same God self is your God self. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thine own God self. Jesus said, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Jesus Christ is the full manifestation of the Son of God. He is one with the Holy Christ self of each one of us, and therefore anything done to any part of life is done to the Christ of that life, and is therefore done to Jesus. One of the things that keeps us from seeing things as they really are is that criticism, condemnation, and judgment of others and of ourselves. The Masters El Morya and Saint Germain have repeatedly warned against the subtle and insidious habit of criticism, condemnation, and judgment. They have not told us that we should not have discrimination, that we should not know right from wrong and light from darkness, and be able to read vibrations. They have simply said, do not criticize, condemn, or judge. They do not want us to be blind to good and evil in ourselves and one another. But do not condemn others for that condition, but pray for them. They remind us of the law of karma, which decrees that whatever we do, or think, or say, or feel, comes full circle to our doorstep for resolution. If we don't monitor our thoughts and feelings, then how can we even begin to discipline what goes forth from us as feeling, as thought, gathering more of its kind, circling the globe and returning to our doorstep, the full-grown plant of the seed that we sent out? Any harmful act, El Morya says, is referred to the Holy Christ self and becomes a part of the life record of the person who commits it. And it must one day be balanced before the lords of karma. Whether mankind like this idea, whether it appeals to them or not, The fact remains that it is pure truth, and I am determined to declare it, says Moria, as a protection to those who observe its precepts. He says, ever so frequently conceited individuals who count themselves exceedingly wise determine that they shall criticize or judge another. They do this although fully aware of the scriptures which clearly state the great law, judge not that ye be not judged, for with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you again. That is from the New Testament, and it is a clear statement of the irrevocable law of karma. Moria continues, Saint Germain, aware of the seriousness of this law, has continuously admonished his students to stop all criticism, condemnation, and judgment. He knows that such acts always travel the full circle back to the very door of the one sending them out. For God's laws are impersonal and impartial in their application and intent. When applied by human reason or observation to another without being voiced, criticism is mildly destructive. But when it is uttered aloud to another, it is amplified at least 10 times. En route to the one criticized, it gathers more of the elements of the mass mind's condemnation until it is an arrow both sharp and swift, finding easy penetration into the tender mind of the one to whom it is directed, unless that one is extremely alert and maintains a force field of the tube of light and of protection with calls to Archangel Michael and the sword of blue flame. You must be extremely alert to not be the victim at subconscious levels of other people's criticism, condemnation, and judgment, and not only of that, of their envy, jealousy, and ignorance, which saps you of your strength. When you feel you have no strength in your body, it is often because someone is lusting after your light. They want it so much, or they want what you have, that they draw it to themselves from you. El Moria's quote continues, when released by a friend or relative to whom the individual is receptive, criticism often lodges within the subconscious mind to perform its work of destruction as an arrow of pestilence, silent, invisible, insidious. Moria says countless men and women of world stature have been hindered in their missions, and some have been completely diverted from their life plan by the deliberate or thoughtless acts of others through criticism. Some of these, when lying as helpless victims of this form of destructivity, have been ignored by the righteous who murmur, they must have deserved this. It must have been their karma. Moria stresses 2 points of great import to the student who would successfully avert such calamity and calumny. Firstly, avoid participation in judgment and condemnation in any measure. Secondly, be good Samaritans to those who are the victims of this human cruelty. By carrying out these 2 services, you will become, in effect, participants in the tenets of the Order of Samaria, or the Good Samaritans, of which I have been master for centuries. You will also be doing the will of God and ensuring the protection of the light to your own life stream. End of El Moria's quotes. El Moria offers solutions to the bad habit of criticism, condemnation, and judgment. One of these solutions you should take to heart. He says, walk in another's moccasins. He once taught, I have written on the momentum of criticism, condemnation, and judgment. Beware of its subtlety in your mind. Beware of its subtlety in your pride. Walk in another's moccasins, literally. If you find yourself being critical of someone, take on yourself a penance. Ask that one's Holy Christ self and the Lords of Karma to give you that one's moccasins for 24 hours. See how you feel bearing that one's karma and burden. See how you come to know what striving your brothers and sisters may have in their hearts that you do not see, whereby they accomplish their daily tasks against odds you know not of, and conditions in the body that try them. End of quote. Another factor that prevents us from seeing things as they really are is jumping to conclusions. Sometimes the mind is like a grasshopper. It literally jumps to conclusions. It reacts to a situation out of ignorance rather than responding with thoughtful consideration. We assume somebody did such and such a thing based on hearsay, rumor, gossip, and tales told many times over with a variation on the theme each time. The 19th century humorist Josh Billings once said, "The trouble ain't that people are ignorant, it's that they know so much that ain't so." Mark Prophet always used to say, "Whenever you assume instead of getting the facts firsthand, you make an ass out of you and me." ASSUME, assume. Every Chila around here who approaches me with the word assume, I assume that I should do this, gets stopped right there, and we go into this lesson. So don't assume anything. The Buddhist scholar Nyanaponika Thera teaches that one antidote for the bad habit of jumping to conclusions is to look and wait and see. He says, generally, we are more concerned with handling and using things than with knowing them in their true nature. Thus, we usually grasp in haste the very first few signals conveyed to us by a perception. Then, through deeply ingrained habit, those signals evoke a standard response by way of judgments, such as good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant, useful or harmful, right or wrong. How can we curb our rash reactions and replace them by moments of mindfulness and reflection? To do so will depend on our capacity to stop and pause, to apply the brakes at the right time, to say, wait a minute. In that practice, we train ourselves to look and wait, to suspend reactions or slow them down. Our motto should be, avoid hasty judgments. Gautama said, "He whose mind is concentrated sees things as they really are. A concentrated mind is a young mind." Remember what the Taoist masters have taught. A young mind is not moved by distracting thoughts or circumstances, either from within or without. A young mind does not jump to conclusions. Another kind of ignorance that keeps us from seeing things as they really are is spiritual pride and intellectual conceit. Spiritual pride is believing that you are more spiritual than someone else, that you are spiritually a superior being to all other lesser mortals. Intellectual conceit is believing you are of superior intelligence, hence above those on the intellectual or the spiritual path. Babaji once gave his disciple Lahiri Mahasaya a lesson in humility. Babaji is an unascended Himalayan master who is said to have retained his physical form for centuries. Babaji had promised Lahiri, "I shall come whenever you need me." One day during a short vacation from his work, Lahiri attended a holy festival. He later recalled, "As I wandered amidst the throng of monks and holy men that had come from great distances to attend the holy festival, I noticed an ash-smeared ascetic who was holding a begging bowl. The thought arose in my mind that the man was hypocritical, wearing the outward symbols of renunciation without a corresponding inward grace. No sooner had I passed the ascetic than my astounded eye fell on Babaji. He was kneeling in front of a matted-haired anchorite. "Guruji," I exclaimed, and hastened to his side. "Sir, what are you doing here?" He replied, "I am washing the feet of this renunciant, and then I shall clean his cooking utensils." Babaji smiled at me like a little child. I knew he was intimating that he wanted me to criticize no one, but to see the Lord as residing equally in all body temples, whether of superior or inferior men. The great Guru added, "By serving wise and ignorant holy men, I am learning the greatest of virtues, pleasing to God above all others, humility." In his story about Sannyasin and the butcher, Vivekananda shows us how spiritual pride and intellectual conceit can keep us from seeing things as they really are, especially ourselves. A sannyasin is someone who lives without possessions and has renounced the world. A young sannyasin went to a forest where he meditated, worshipped, and practiced yoga for a long time. After much hard work and practice, he was one day sitting under a tree when some dry leaves fell upon his head. He looked up and saw a crow and a crane fighting on the top of the tree. This made him very angry. He said, "What? How dare you throw these dry leaves upon my head?" With these words he angrily looked at them, and a flash of fire went out. Such was the yogi's power, and burnt the birds to ashes. He was very glad, almost overjoyed at this development of power. He could burn the crow and the crane by a look. After a time, he had to go to town to beg his bread. He stood at a door and called out, "Woman, give me food." A voice came from inside the house, "Wait a little, my son." The young man thought, "You wretched woman, how dare you make me wait? You do not yet know my power." While he was thinking thus, the woman said again, "Boy, don't be thinking too much of yourself. Here is neither crow nor crane." He was astonished. Still he had to wait. At last the woman came, and he humbly said to her, "How did you know that?" She said, "My boy, I do not know your yoga or your other practices. I am a simple, ordinary woman. I made you wait because my husband is ill and I was nursing him. All my life I have struggled to do my duty. When I was unmarried, I did my duty to my parents. Now that I am married, I do my duty to my husband. That is all the yoga I practice. But by doing my duty, I have become illumined. Thus I could read your thoughts and know what you had done in the forest." She further told him that if he wanted to know something higher, he should go to the market of a certain town. There he would find a Vijada who would tell him something that he would be very glad to learn. A Vijada is one belonging to the lowest class of people who were mostly hunters and butchers. The sannyasin thought, "Why should I go to that town and to a Vijada?" But after what he had seen, his mind had opened a little, so he went. When he came to town, he found the market and there saw at a distance a big fat Vijada cutting meat with a big knife, talking and bargaining with different people. The young man said, "Lord, help me. Is this the man from whom I am going to learn? He is the incarnation of a demon if he is anything." In the meantime, the man looked up and said, "Oh, Swami, did a lady send you here?" "Take a seat until I have done my business." The sannyasin thought, "What comes to me here?" He took a seat, however. The man went on with his work, and after he had finished, he took his money and said to the sannyasin, "Come, sir, come to my home." On reaching home, the Vyada gave him a seat, saying, "Wait here," and he went into the house. He then bathed his old father and mother, fed them, and did all he could to please them, after which he came to the sannyasin and said, "Now, sir, you have come here to see me. What can I do for you?" The sannyasin asked him a few questions about the soul and about God, and the Vyada gave him a profound lecture. When the Vyada finished his teaching, the sannyasin was astonished. He said, "Why are you in that body? With such knowledge as yours, why are you in a Vyada's body and doing such filthy, ugly work?" "My son," replied the Vyada, "no duty is ugly, no duty is impure. My birth placed me in these circumstances and this environment. In my boyhood, I learnt the trade. I am unattached, and I try to do my duty well as a householder. I do all I can to make my mother and father happy. I neither know your yoga, nor have become a sannyasin, nor have I left the world to meditate in a forest. Nevertheless, all that I know has come to me through the unattached doing of the duty which belongs to my position." This is the end of the story by Vivekananda. It is a profound teaching. In this case, seeing things as they really are is seeing what is our dharma and our karma. When we look realistically at our karma and our dharma, we are beginning to see as our Holy Christ Self sees and would have us see. Our dharma is our reason for being. It is our duty, which we are impelled to fulfill. You do not pick your dharma, you are your dharma, and what you are dictates your duty. Some people do not want to strive to fulfill what is their dharma or duty in life. They want to step down a number of rungs on the ladder and do someone else's dharma that is much easier, that they themselves have mastered in a previous lifetime. They don't want to make the effort to rise to the level that is the calling from God in this life. We are also absolutely duty-bound to balance our karma and to live at the station of our karma, that is, until we balance it and move up the scale of being. As the enlightened butcher in this story explains, "My birth placed me in these circumstances and this environment. I try to do my duty well. All that I know has come to me through the unattached doing of the duty which belongs to my position." The butcher is content to do his duty because he knows that when he has fulfilled one step of the great law, the law itself will guarantee him the next step. But some people willfully ignore the mandates of their karma. This is what I have observed as the conceit of ignorance. I think the conceit of ignorance is one of the conditions of consciousness that most vexes our beloved Guru El Morya. The conceit of ignorance makes people believe they are human gods, gods in their own right, petty tyrants who can control the elements of everyday life and nature itself. Often their hoarding of money reinforces this notion. With vast power and money at their disposal, they think they rule the world. And so with all of their karma and all of their absence of God mastery, some people still believe that they are the arbiters of their own destiny. You are not the arbiter of your own destiny until you are a karma-free being. And even then, you are not the arbiter of your own destiny. From the point when first you made karma the priority in your life became the balancing of that karma. So your karma took you away from being in a position of mandating your destiny, of being the arbiter of it. Your karma mandates your social position, your situation in life, what you are free to do and be, and what you are not free to do and be. And until your karma is balanced, the fulfillment of your divine plan may have to take a back seat. Both the old woman and the butcher put first things first. They put their karma and their duty to serve others first, and they went the extra mile to balance their karma and ensoul their dharma. You must also realize, as they did, that there is karma that you must absolutely balance in this lifetime, and you should move heaven and earth to do so. This is what we learned from PHYLOS the Tibetan. Zalem had to wait 12 or 13,000 years in Devachan before he could re-embody. You'll recall that Devachan is the first 3 levels of the etheric octave. It's the place of wish fulfillment after one passes from the screen of life. So it can take that long for you and all the people you have karma with to come together under the right circumstances so that you and everyone you have karma with and everyone who has karma with you can balance that karma together. So people in the conceit of ignorance think that they can decide in what future time they will fulfill their responsibilities to this or that person whom they just don't feel like serving right now. People think they can decide when down the road of life they will have the child that they are now going to abort. People think they can decide when they will get around to doing this or that unenviable task of their karma. You know what? Those who are willfully ignorant are often the most conceited people you will find walking the earth. Just make sure you are no longer counted among them. Another insight I had from this story of the sannyasin is that one's duty to ensoul the Dharma is the duty to embody the body of Dharma, or the great Dharmakaya, which is the great causal body. Our duty to bring the elements of our causal body into play in everything we do on earth. This is what our duty is, to draw down from that great causal body, to gain mastery through it, and to bless all life. Perhaps the most extreme and explosive form of ignorance that stems from not seeing things as they really are is racial bigotry. Prejudice, wrote William Hazlitt, is the child of ignorance. When you are born and bred into this kind of ignorance, or ignorance, it is not easy to free yourself from it. One of the best examples of someone who emerged from bigotry to see things as they really are is Malcolm X. How many of you have seen that movie? I recommend it to every Chila. It is a very important movie. It gives a social, political history of our time, an understanding of Islam, and the understanding of one man's crusade to truly find what is real. You will go away truly having respect, if not love, for Malcolm X. He was an African-American religious and political leader. He preached bitterly against the white oppression of his people. When you look at his background, you can see why Malcolm X had such a negative perception of whites. I believe it would be almost impossible, he said, to find anywhere in America a black man who has lived further down in the mud of human society than I have, or a black man who has suffered more anguish during his life than I have. In his autobiography, Malcolm X said that 2 white men burned down his house when he was 4 years old, and it was rumored that the Ku Klux Klan or another racist group had murdered his father. The state welfare agency decided that his mother could not raise 8 children by herself, so they sent Malcolm to a foster home. Later, his mother suffered a nervous breakdown and was committed to a mental institution. All but 2 of the children were sent to foster homes. Malcolm attended a junior high school where he was the only Negro. He was one of the top students. One day, his English teacher asked him what career he wanted to pursue. When he replied, "I've been thinking I'd like to be a lawyer," his teacher advised him to become a carpenter instead. "A lawyer," his teacher said, "that's no realistic goal for a nigger." Malcolm said that this was a major turning point in his life. See it as an example of criticism, condemnation, and judgment upon this child by someone he respects, his teacher. The condemnation comes upon him, and he never pursues the goal. Instead, he realized that no matter how good he was, he would never be good enough to make it in a white society. Malcolm left school after the 8th grade and began hanging out in the streets. I was schooled well, he wrote, by experts in such hustles as the numbers, pimping, con games of many kinds, peddling dope, and thievery of all sorts, including armed robbery. He finally ended up in jail for burglary. While serving his 7-year prison sentence, he converted to the black Muslim faith and began to live by a strict moral code. After his release from prison, he became a black Muslim minister. He was a very popular and eloquent speaker for the cause of black liberation. He exhorted African Americans to take pride in themselves, to separate themselves from white culture, and to become self-sufficient. He even encouraged blacks to form a separate nation. He often referred to white people as white devils. He would say, "You cannot find one black man, I do not care who he is, who has not been personally damaged in some way by the devilish acts of the collective white man. Every time you see a white man, think about the devil you're seeing." In 1964, he decided to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, the spiritual center of Islam. There he saw devout Muslims of all races and colors praying together. It changed his life. He began to see things through a new pair of eyes, and those new pair of eyes turned out to be colorblind. He wrote a letter to his fellow Muslims about his second religious conversion. In it he said, "I have never before seen sincere and true brotherhood practiced by all colors together." After his return, Malcolm X announced his conversion to Orthodox Islam. He no longer advocated that blacks form their own separate nation. Instead, he sought to create a society in which there could exist honest white-black brotherhood. He told reporters at a press conference, "My trip to Mecca has opened my eyes. I no longer subscribe to racism." He told audiences, "Since I learned the truth in Mecca, my dearest friends have come to include all kinds, some Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, agnostics, and even atheists. My friends today are black, brown, red, yellow, and white." On February 21st, 1965, less than a year after his pilgrimage, Malcolm X was shot to death at a rally in Harlem. A great and profound tragedy for America and our generation. When I read about his life and feel the heart of this man, I am so grateful for reincarnation. And I am so grateful for the good that he did and the stand that he finally took that can inspire all of us. To think that he can re-embody on the basis of that good karma brings my heart great joy. His story shows us how the experiences we have had in this life can keep us from seeing things as they really are. Malcolm himself wrote, "The true brotherhood I had seen in the holy world had influenced me to recognize that anger can blind human vision." This is his confession, that his anger against what the white man had done to his mother, to his family, to his father, to his people, had blinded him. Blinded him in the sense that it took from him the most precious gift of all, the centeredness in his holy Christ self. This is the great, great damage that race hatred does to people. It takes from them the centeredness because of the reaction, the resentment, the need for revenge, the need for retaliation, and therefore swinging too far instead of coming into the center. And so what he said is true. Bigotry is like having a blindfold on, but not knowing it. Gautama's disciples once told him of a group of wandering hermits and scholars who constantly argued amongst themselves about religious matters. Gautama compared them to blind men. He said, "These sectarians, brethren, are blind and unseeing. They know not the real, they know not the unreal, they know not the truth, they know not the untruth. In such a state of ignorance do they dispute and quarrel, as ye describe." Now in former times there was a Raja who lived in Savatthi. That Raja called to a certain man, saying, "Come now, good fellow, go and gather together all the blind men that are in Savatthi." When they were assembled, the Raja said, "Then, my good man, show the blind men an elephant." "Very good, your majesty," said the man, and did as he was told, saying, "O ye blind, such as this is an elephant." And to one man he presented the head of the elephant, to another the ear, to another a tusk, the trunk, the foot, back, tail, and tuft of the tail, saying to each one, that was the elephant. Thereupon that Raja went up to the blind men and said to each, "Have you studied the elephant?" "Yes, your majesty," they said. "Then tell me your conclusions about him." Thereupon those who had been presented with a head answered, "Your majesty, an elephant is just like a pot." And those who had only felt the ear replied, "An elephant is just like a winnowing basket." Those who had been presented with the tusk said it was a plowshare. Those who knew only the trunk said it was a plow. The body, said they, is a granary, the foot a pillar, the back a mortar, the tail a pestle, the tuft of the tail just a broom. Then they began to quarrel, shouting, "Yes, it is. No, it isn't. An elephant is not that. Yes, it's like that," and so on, till they came to fisticuffs about the matter. Then that Raja was delighted with the scene, said Gautama. Just so are these sectarians who are wanderers, blind, unseeing, knowing not the truth, but each maintaining it is thus and thus. Commenting on the same story, Ramakrishna concluded, "A man who has seen only one aspect of God limits God to that alone. It is his conviction that God cannot be anything else." Is that not the problem of all of the many religions and sects we find in America today? Someone gets a vision of God and they say, "This is God, all must worship him this way." Ramakrishna said, "The truth is that with sincerity and earnestness, one can realize God through all religions." Like the blind men touching the elephant, everyone's view of the truth depends on their perspective. How many times are we convinced that we are absolutely right about something until we move a little to the right or to the left and change our perspective? I can tell you, I have seen the blind men and the elephant firsthand. In the Paradise Valley in Montana, the members of my church, Church Universal and Triumphant, and I are the elephant. And the blind men are all the people who tell their version of what the church is and what it isn't. Just as in Gautama's story, each of the blind men have touched only one part of the elephant, and some who present themselves as experts have not touched the elephant at all. But each one has his own elephant tale to tell, and here are some examples. Blind man number 1 says, Elizabeth Clare Prophet and members of Church Universal and Triumphant are not Christian. False. The most recent expression of this canard came in a letter to the editor of the Livingston Enterprise by a local resident. She wrote, "What I wish they would do is come forth and admit that they are not Christian. Let them call a spade a spade. The whole New Age movement, whether associated with or without a specific church, wants to exalt man, putting him equal with God. This is, along with many of their other teachings, anti-Christ teaching, i.e. not Christian. Believe what you will, just don't call yourself Christian when you are not." The charge that we are not Christian, of course, is patently untrue. As anyone who has familiarized himself with the tenets and teachings of our church knows, I accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, as do members of my church. How much more Christian can you get? We do not exalt man and make him equal to God. We believe that we should strive to become one with God. What this woman has said is what pastors across the land are feeding their congregations, feeding them with fear of those who say they are Christian but are not. And so these who are members of the congregation take what is fed to them by their pastors, and they walk in fear, and they walk in condemnation and judgment of others as a result of it. The teaching on this comes right out of the Bible. John said, "Now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." And so it is not that we are making ourselves equal with God, but we accept what the Bible says, that we are the sons of God. Jesus told us to be perfect. Be therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. And he also promised his disciples, "If a man love me, he will keep my words, and my Father will love him, and we will come unto him and make our abode with him." This oneness with God then does surely make us the vessel for that God manifestation and that flame. Blind man number 2 says, Church Universal and Triumphant is a cult, and Elizabeth Clare Prophet practices brainwashing. False. The people who call us a cult often have different definitions of a cult, but their basic accusation has 3 parts. Cults are not legitimate religions. Cults knowingly use deception to recruit members, and cults keep members against their will by coercive persuasion or brainwashing. In the case of Church Universal and Triumphant, we are upfront about what we believe. We do not deceive people. We have nothing to hide. No one is being held here against their will. The gate is open, free for you to enter, free for you to exit. In fact, according to the scientific community, there is no such thing as brainwashing as the term has been applied to religious organizations like our church. Dr. Margaret Singer, a psychologist, Dr. Richard Offshee, a sociologist, are the leading proponents of the brainwashing theory as they apply it to so-called cults. They go around testifying as expert witnesses in court, but the real experts in the scientific community now regard their theories as pseudo-scientific. More and more, they are not allowed to testify in court as experts on mind control because, as Judge D. Lowell Jensen wrote, their ideas are not generally accepted within the scientific community. It is impossible for this organization to manifest an attitude of brainwashing or of control by the leader, because it is entirely contrary to our religious conviction that each man must walk under his own vine and fig tree, under his own holy Christ self and I am presence, and become that individualization of the God flame by applying the laws of the ages and the great teachings that come out of the East and out of our Bible. Blind man number 3 says, Mrs. Prophet anticipated and predicted the imminent end of the world. False. I always tell people when repudiating this that Nostradamus has prophesied in his quatrains well beyond the year 3000. I do not believe in the imminent end of the world. I never predicted the apocalypse or the end of the world. The press transformed my warnings of a possible nuclear war into predictions of the end of the world. The so-called end of the world predictions were the product of inaccurate and sensationalistic reporting. The University of Washington newspaper, The Daily, was one of the few papers to recognize this. Its reporter, who came here to examine the elephant for himself, observed, the major factual error that most national publications ran is that the church said the world was going to end on Monday, April 23rd. Church members never made this proclamation. This statement was originally printed in one publication and was repeated many times over. In 1986, I warned of a possible nuclear war sometime in the future and recommended that all Americans protect themselves by building fallout shelters. In 1989, I said that the 12-year period beginning April 23, 1990, would bring increasing returning negative karma and the likelihood of war, economic collapse, famine, and earth changes. Since that time, we've seen the war in the Middle East, the war in Yugoslavia, and we have seen famine, which we are dealing with finally, and we've seen any number of earth changes. We've seen economic collapse. We've seen the collapse of banking houses, of insurance companies, and businesses in this nation and around the world, reaching as far away as Japan. We built a shelter for our staff, and many of the members of my church have built fallout shelters too. A fallout shelter is the only real form of insurance in the event of a nuclear incident. Can you imagine after a nuclear war that your insurance agent is going to come and present you with a check to pay for the damage? We face all kinds of nuclear threats, from a Chernobyl-like accident or nuclear terrorism by a Gaddafi or a Saddam Hussein to an accidental launch or a full-scale nuclear war. So much for that. We wish that all Americans had some form of shelter, and a very inexpensive shelter can be built to protect people in the first 2 weeks, 2 to 6 weeks, when the danger is so great of death because of fallout. Blind man number 4 says, "Prophet calls herself Mother of the Universe. She is worshipped by her followers." False. This is a complete fabrication. I have never referred to myself as the Mother of the Universe. Members of my church refer to me as Mother, just as they would a Mother Superior in a convent. And this is only because of my devotion to the flame of God as Mother. In the Keepers of the Flame fraternity, I hold the office that Saint Germain set up, which is called Mother of the Flame. It was occupied previously by Clara Louise Kinninger, who made her ascension. I do not teach anyone to, quote, worship me. The members of my church consider me to be their sister, their friend, and perhaps their teacher. We have a profound love for one another. They respect me, but they do not worship me. In the life of Saint Isa, an ancient text recorded by Buddhist historians, Jesus is quoted as having said, "Respect woman, for she is the mother of the universe. She gives birth to you. Bless her and worship her, for she is your one friend, your one support on earth." Thus Jesus has declared that all women, all souls who embody in the feminine incarnation, are called upon to embody the Mother of the Universe. Blind man number 5 says, "Church Universal and Triumphant is a big-time developer that is ruining the pristine environment next to Yellowstone Park." False. The Royal Teton Ranch, the home of our international headquarters, shares 5 miles of border with Yellowstone National Park. We cherish this land. We have not ruined it, and we do not intend to. The fact is, most of the ranch is open range and farmland and majestic mountains. Our 12,000-acre Royal Teton Ranch South, which borders the park, has less than 2% of its acreage developed. In contrast, Yellowstone Park, by its own accounting, has developed at least 5% of its acreage. The local people are up in arms because they claim we are ruining the environment. Yet on the last night of our July conference, in the heart of the inner retreat, some local vandals chopped down 2 fir trees so they would fall across the road and block people from leaving the conference site. I came upon these trees just moments after they had fallen across the road. That was at 3 a.m. after I finished counseling devotees who had come. These trees were at least 100 years old. Because the first tree didn't fall the way the vandals wanted it to, they just felled another one. Can you imagine hurting sacred life? To us, every tree on this property is sacred, every blade of grass. And yet, just to spite the church, they committed this crime against these magnificent trees. So very often, visitors or reporters will come to the ranch and stop in at the ranch office. And they will say, "Where's all the development we've been hearing about? Where's all the ruining of the environment? We can't find it." And we have to tell them, this is it. This is our ranch office area, and then we have our ranch headquarters, and there isn't any more development besides what's at Eastgate. So they're very astonished and become very aware of how the papers have drummed this message and drummed this message until people believe it far and wide. Blind man number 6 says, Church Universal and Triumphant never gives anything to charities. False. This very year, we donated over 400 pounds of frozen turkeys grown on our ranch, 2,250 pounds of vegetables to the food banks in Livingston and Bozeman to help feed needy people in Park and Gallatin counties. In the last 5 years, we have donated $25,000 to the local Park County Hospital to keep it operational. So these are just a few of the elephant tales rumored about us. Many of these rumors have found their way into the press, and many reporters have copied the false reports without checking the facts with us. It is a case of the blind leading the blind. Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, if a blind man leads a blind man, both of them will fall into a hole. Habit number 8. In order to break the habit of ignorance, invoke the violet flame to consume unconscious anger as the source of ignorance. As I said earlier, anger against God is the root of all ignorance. No one of us really thinks we're angry against God. I've heard of some people now and then who do recognize that, but for the most part, it is at a subconscious or unconscious level. Ignorant animal magnetism, which is the ignorance we're talking about, is the mask for the degrees of rage which we call malicious animal magnetism. So I'd like to give you the definition of these types of animal magnetism. Malicious animal magnetism, which is what we must deal with, is malice aforethought, that is beforehand, calculated, planned, premeditated malice. It is willful hatred or condemnation of God and His creation, using black magic and witchcraft. This falls in the etheric quadrant. If you take a circle and divide it up into 4 quarters, it is the first quarter from the 12 to the 2 o'clock line. If you look in the Great White Brotherhood book, you will see that the 12, 1 and 2 o'clock lines have as their powers God power, God love, and God mastery. You will note the chakras, and you will note the perversions of those chakras. They all come under malicious animal magnetism. Ignorant animal magnetism, or base ignorance, comes in the mental quadrant that goes from the 3 to the 5 o'clock line. Ignorant animal magnetism is a state of density in the mental and feeling worlds that blocks the mind of Christ from expressing through your lower mental body. So if you look at the chart of the 3, 4, and 5 o'clock lines, you'll note the chakras and the perversions. This is the compartment of your being. It is your mental body, and the etheric quadrant is your etheric body. So in those levels of consciousness, this is where this substance is recorded and where it needs to be transmuted by your invocation of the violet flame. Sympathetic animal magnetism falls in the desire body, which we also call the emotional body. So this is sympathy with or identifying with your own or another's human consciousness rather than expressing the divine compassion of the Christ. This is the 6, 7, and 8 o'clock lines. And it is that astral body which is the lowest vibrating body of the 4 in terms of karmic condition. Delicious animal magnetism falls in the physical quadrant, the 9 o'clock line, 9, 10, and 11. This describes the indulgence of the physical appetites, overeating, oversleeping, excessive sex, the constant preening and adorning of the body, to the neglect of spirituality. So it is attractions of the flesh and of the eye. You can again review the qualities on those lines by studying our chart. So we find that rage is such a powerful misqualification of the sacred fire that it actually consumes the cells of the brain. By studying the teachings of the Ascended Masters and by using the violet flame, those who have lost their mental capacity may be able to regain some of what they once had. In her dictation entitled Forgive and be forgiven, the Ascended Lady Master and Bodhisattva Kuan Yin addressed the problem of anger against God. She said, I am the opening of the way unto the mercy of God, which you must first give to God, if you would receive it from him. Give mercy unto God and forgive God of all those things that you have blamed him for. People blame him for tornadoes, for sudden death, for accidents, for their illnesses, for all kinds of calamities that come to them as a result of their karma. You may not know that you have blamed God, but in subconscious, unconscious levels of being, many people, in fact the majority, do hold against God the circumstances of the karmic law of retribution that does affect them. Therefore, there is an anger against God and a non-forgiving of God. If you would be forgiven, beloved, you must first recognize that it is you who have transgressed against God. Call upon the law of forgiveness and the violet transmuting flame. See yourself drenched in a holy unguent of purple fire, in a balm of violet ray. See yourself receiving that mercy in proportion as you give it, for it is the law that you will reap mercy only as you sow mercy. The surest path to divine justice and divine mercy is the violet flame. The surest path to soul liberation and the balancing of karma is the violet flame. The surest path to adeptship in the flame of Christ's truth is the violet flame. The surest path to the expansion of the heart is the love meditation in mercy's ray. So forgive and be forgiven. Thank you very much for your very kind attention.